Javon, I want to come to you because, I mean, you're his friend. You were on the island on the 4th. You were on a different boat. Do you recall seeing him at all that day?
Yes, ma'am. I did see him when I was out there on the island.
Can you tell me what you saw? Does anything seem strange to you about the difference that people are saying of how he was separated from the group?
No, ma'am. I don't think that Nolan would say, hey, bro, I'm staying with this girl on the island.
Somewhere on Horn Island, there is a 15-minute gap that no one has ever been able to explain. Not the friends who were there, not the family, not, as of this recording, the investigators looking into it. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why that gap matters more than almost anything else in this case. But first, you need to hear the story the way most people heard it. There is one story that has been repeated more than any other about what happened to Nolan Wells on Horn Island. It comes from the people who were with him that day. They say nothing forced them to leave without him. They say Nolan met a young woman on the island, decided on his own to stay behind, and planned to catch another ride back later that night. That is the version that has circulated for weeks now, and it has stayed remarkably consistent. Multiple members of the group have repeated it, separately, across several interviews, over several weeks, not once, not twice, over and over, to different reporters, on different days. What's confirmed is this. A group of friends traveled to Horn Island together on July 4th, 2026. Later that same day, the group returned to the mainland, and Nolan was not with them.
What did we just hear? What was that?
A distress call went out from a boat that afternoon. 2 days later, Nolan was found. Everything else, the reasons, the choices, the final hours in between, that's where the story stops being simple. Because a consistent story is not the same thing as a resolved one. Consistency tells you a group of people are sticking to the same sequence of events. It doesn't tell you whether that sequence is complete. It doesn't tell you whether it's accurate. It only tells you that, so far, no one involved has changed their account. And in the weeks since that first version went public, a second account has entered the record. One that doesn't come from the water, or the boat, or that afternoon at all. It comes from someone who knew Nolan long before Horn Island ever mattered. Someone whose knowledge of him wasn't built in a single day, but over years. Before this video goes any further, one thing needs to be said plainly. This is not a video that claims to know what happened to Nolan Wells. No official cause of death has been released. No charges have been filed. No agency investigating this case has said on the record that a crime occurred. What this video is going to do instead is lay out, carefully, what's actually known, what's been claimed but not confirmed, and what still hasn't been explained by anyone, on either side of this story. Some of what follows will be uncomfortable. Some of it will raise more questions than it answers. That's not a flaw in the reporting. That's simply the current state of this case, as of everything that's been made public so far. His name is Javon Williams, Nolan's best friend. In a televised interview, Javon said something that quietly reframed the entire case. He said the story doesn't sound like Nolan, not because he witnessed the exact moment the group decided to leave. He didn't. He'd already been bumped onto a different boat earlier that afternoon, when there wasn't enough room left on the one Nolan was on. But he was on Horn Island that day. He saw Nolan before the group split apart, one last time, before everyone went their separate ways across different boats. And what he's describing to the cameras isn't a theory about that one afternoon. It's a pattern, one he says he watched play out for years, without exception. According to Javon, whenever Nolan traveled somewhere with his friends, he came back with them. Every trip, every time. Not most of the time, every time, as far as Javon has ever known. That distinction matters. Javon isn't claiming to have overheard a conversation he never heard. He's not claiming direct knowledge of what happened in the final minutes before the boats left the dock. What he's offering is narrower than an eyewitness account. and in some ways more uncomfortable to sit with. A character-based challenge. The explanation being offered publicly doesn't match the person he's known for years. And there's one specific detail that Javon keeps returning to, one that seems small until you actually sit with it. Nolan, according to the friend's account, stayed behind on the island without ever asking anyone for his phone. To Javon, that's the detail that doesn't add up. Not the girl, not the decision to stay, the phone. Because in his experience, that's not something Nolan would have left behind, whatever else he chose to do that day. Here's where the story becomes harder to dismiss as one friend's gut feeling. Because Nolan's father has said almost exactly the same thing, independently, without any indication the two coordinated. His name is Elmore Wanley. Elmore has said publicly that he cannot understand why his son would have chosen to separate from the group he arrived with. He says Nolan was raised on a simple rule, repeated at home from an early age. If you go somewhere together, you come back together. Staying with your group wasn't a suggestion in that household. It was framed as a basic safety rule, the kind you don't break casually. There's no indication the father and the best friend planned their remarks together, or even spoke before giving their separate interviews. They arrived at the same conclusion from two completely different relationships with Nolan. One built over a lifetime as family, watching him grow up. The other built over years of friendship, watching him show up for the people around him. That's not proof of anything on its own, but it is a pattern. And a pattern that surfaces twice, from two unconnected sources, is harder to wave away than either statement would be alone. Before going further into Javon's account, it's worth pausing on someone with no personal connection to Nolan at all. Legal commentator Nancy Grace has publicly raised a list of questions she says remain unanswered in this case. Among them, the independent autopsy, arranged by the family, which could not determine a definitive cause of death. Physical findings noted during that exam, which she says remain open to more than one interpretation, and which the family's team has not been able to fully explain. The fact that some physical evidence stayed in the hands of state investigators, meaning the family's own examiner never had full access to everything collected, and the ongoing conflict between the account given by the young woman Nolan reportedly stayed behind for, and the account given by his friends, which doesn't line up cleanly with hers. What stands out here is what Grace didn't say. She did not claim any of this proves wrongdoing. She said an accidental explanation is still on the table, that the investigation could still move in more than one direction, depending on what the sealed findings eventually show. That's not a conclusion, it's just an observation. But it's one worth holding on to, because it sets the tone for everything that follows in this case. Restraint, not certainty. It's also worth noting that Grace is not a disinterested figure in true crime coverage. She's built a career on cases like this one, and her willingness to hold back from a definitive verdict here, when a more sensational take would almost certainly draw more attention, says something about how genuinely unresolved these particular details are. If even a commentator known for strong opinions on unexplained deaths is choosing to sit in the uncertainty rather than resolve it for the cameras, that's a reasonable signal that the uncertainty is real, and not just a storytelling device. Before weighing anything else against it, it's worth hearing the original account in full, because it hasn't changed much across weeks of scrutiny, and that consistency is real evidence, not nothing. Traston Shepard, one of the friends who was there that day, told national media that the group left Horn Island in the late afternoon of July 4th, after Nolan chose to stay behind with a young woman he'd met earlier that same day. Shepard has maintained, in every interview since, that everyone in the group has fully cooperated with investigators throughout the process. Warren Hudson, another member of the group, has described a boat taking on water, mechanical trouble slowing the departure, and a decision to leave made under the belief that Nolan had voluntarily chosen to stay behind, and would find his own way back to the mainland later that night. These interviews were conducted separately, by different outlets, over an extended period of time. And the core outline hasn't shifted in any of them. That's meaningful. A story that survives repeated retelling, under repeated questioning from skeptical reporters, deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed outright. But as of Javon's interview entering the public record, it's no longer the only version being taken seriously. Here's where a piece of misinformation needs to be addressed directly, because a clip circulating online has been doing a lot of unearned work in shaping public opinion.
This is the most up-to-date Nolan Wells piece of information that just doesn't line up. You've heard a lot so far, but this one is really taking the cake for me. By now, everyone has heard the recording of the Sea Tow, which is like a towing company for boats.
A video shared widely on social media appeared, to some viewers, to show Nolan involved in an argument shortly before he disappeared. Javon disputes that reading of the footage entirely. According to him, the video actually shows a completely different confrontation, involving someone else entirely, someone who had become aggressive, who several people on the island were trying to calm down and remove from the situation. Javon says he and a family member were among the people trying to de-escalate that unrelated incident. In his account, Nolan doesn't appear in that footage at all. That's not a resolved fact, and it shouldn't be treated as one. It's Javon's explanation, now entered into a public record that, until this point, had only speculation to work with when it came to that clip. Still, it's worth noting how a piece of ambiguous footage, stripped of context, can shape an entire public narrative before anyone involved has had the chance to explain it. There's another question that's followed this case since it first went public: whether race played a role in what happened on Horn Island that day. When it was raised directly with Javon, he didn't take the narrative in that direction. He pointed out that friendships across racial lines are common within their community, and that in his view, race wasn't the central issue driving his concerns. What he kept returning to instead were the practical, specific details. The phone that was never asked for, the keys, the things that, in his mind, still don't have a clean, satisfying explanation. That's a notable position to take publicly, because it doesn't reach for the most explosive theory available to him, and it doesn't settle for the simplest, most convenient one either. It stays narrow, focused on what he can actually point to, and what he keeps pointing to is about to get a lot more specific. Now here's where the timeline gets its most detailed new addition, and it doesn't come from Javon at all. It comes from his mother. Her name is Toshima Hans. On the night Nolan was first reported missing, Hans says she joined Christine Wansley in the effort to track down his phone, as concern was growing among the family. That's when investigators, and Hans herself, noticed something unusual. Two separate digital signals were pointing in two different directions. Christine's location tracking information suggested one address. Activity tied to Nolan's Snapchat account suggested a different one entirely. Those conflicting signals complicated the search from the start. Instead of one clear destination, there were two, and no way yet to know which one actually mattered. Hans went to the address the location tracker had pointed to. She says the house was dark when she arrived. No lights visible from outside. After she made contact with the people inside, the phone wasn't handed over right away. She says she waited roughly 15 minutes. During that wait, the explanation for where the phone actually was kept shifting. At one point, someone told her it had been left inside a truck. Then the story changed. She was told a young woman would bring it out instead. On its own, a 15-minute delay proves nothing. People misplace things. Communication breaks down during a chaotic night, with a lot of people coming and going, a lot of confusion about who has what. But that gap hasn't been explained. And Hans isn't reporting a rumor she heard secondhand. She's describing what she says she personally experienced, standing at that door, waiting. That's a different category of account than anything discussed so far in this case. It's not character testimony, like Javon's or Elmore's. It's not the friend's account of that afternoon on the island. It's a direct, first-person description of one specific night, and it adds another loose thread to a timeline that already had more than one. Before moving further into the timeline, it's worth acknowledging what's been happening outside the interviews entirely, because this case didn't stay contained to a handful of network segments. Within days of the first reports, Nolan's name was trending across multiple platforms. Amateur investigators built timelines of their own. Some pulled satellite images of Horn Island, trying to map exactly where the boats would have docked. Others compiled screenshots of the friends' social media accounts, looking for anything that contradicted the official version. Most of it went nowhere. A lot of it was wrong, or at best unverifiable. Theories built on assumptions, not evidence. But the volume of attention did something real. It put pressure on local investigators to move faster, to say more, to release something. That pressure doesn't change what actually happened on Horn Island. It doesn't add or subtract a single fact from the timeline. What it does is explain why this case, which started as a regional story, ended up being covered by national outlets, discussed by legal commentators like Nancy Grace, and picked apart frame by strangers who never met Nolan Wells. Public attention doesn't solve cases, but it does change how they unfold in public. How much scrutiny every account, every clip, every statement receives before it's allowed to stand unchallenged. At this point, the case holds two accounts that don't cancel each other out, and don't fully agree either. On one side, the friends who were physically on Horn Island, whose story hasn't moved much across weeks of repeated interviews and outside questioning. On the other, two people who've known Nolan for years, his best friend and his father, independently saying the decision attributed to him doesn't match who they know him to be. Neither side is claiming to have witnessed the exact moment the boat split up and left the island. The friends are describing what they say they saw and decided that afternoon. Javon and Elmore are describing who Nolan was, across years of knowing him. Those are different kinds of evidence, and it's worth being precise about that difference. Eyewitness testimony describes a specific moment in time. Character testimony describes a long-term pattern of behavior. One doesn't automatically outrank the other, but they don't resolve each other either. They sit side by side, in tension, waiting on something else to settle the question. And that gap is still sitting there, unresolved, as of this recording. But there's a reason it hasn't been resolved, and it has less to do with what people are willing to say, and more to do with what's still locked away. This is where the story shifts from what people are saying publicly to what investigators are still sitting on privately. The state's official autopsy has been completed. It remains sealed, pending presentation to a grand jury. Toxicology results haven't been made public in any form. The agreed-upon forensic examination of Nolan's phone, the one both the family and investigators consented to, hasn't produced any results that have been released. And there's the matter of the STO distress call, specifically, disputed background audio picked up during that call, which different listeners have interpreted in very different ways. No official forensic confirmation has settled what that audio actually contains, or doesn't contain. Investigators have also continued requesting original, unedited photos and video taken on Horn Island that day. Footage that hasn't been cropped, compressed, or reposted a dozen times online, in an effort to piece together a more complete and accurate timeline of that afternoon. Each of those threads, taken on its own, might turn out to mean nothing at all. Together, they're the reason this case hasn't closed. They're the reason two competing accounts are still sitting side by side, with nothing yet to break the tie. It's also worth being clear about what a sealed autopsy does and doesn't mean. Sealing a report ahead of a grand jury presentation is a procedural step, not an accusation. Prosecutors do this to protect the integrity of a potential case, whether or not charges ultimately follow. It happens in cases that end in a ruling of accidental death, just as often as it happens in cases that end in an indictment. So the seal itself isn't evidence of anything. But it does mean the public, and everyone watching this case unfold, is currently working with a smaller set of facts than investigators actually have in hand. That gap between what's known publicly and what's known internally is, in a sense, the entire reason this video exists. It's worth going back, briefly, to a detail introduced earlier in this video, because on its own, in Scene 2, it might have sounded like a small thing, Javon said Nolan never would have stayed behind without asking for his phone. At the time, that was framed as a piece of character testimony, an observation about habits. But by scene 8, that same object, the phone, turns out to be the center of an entirely separate first-person account. Toshi Mahans wasn't describing Nolan's habits. She was describing a specific night, a specific house, and a 15-minute wait for that exact device to be produced. Two completely different people, offering two completely different kinds of evidence. Both keep circling back to the same object. That's not a coincidence built into this video's structure for effect. It's a coincidence built into the actual public record. Javon's interview and Hans's account were given separately, to different outlets, without any indication they coordinated their focus. And when two independent threads in a case both lead back to the same unresolved detail, that's usually where investigators start looking closest. It's worth stepping back here and separating what's confirmed from everything else, because at this point in the coverage, the two have started to blur together in a lot of the public conversation. What's confirmed? Nolan Wells traveled to Horn Island on July 4, 2026, with a group of friends. That same day, the group returned to the mainland without him. A distress call went out from a boat that afternoon. 2 days later, Nolan was found. What's claimed, but not independently confirmed, that Nolan chose, entirely on his own, to stay behind with a young woman he'd just met. That everyone in the group has fully cooperated with investigators from the start. That the 15-minute delay in producing his phone that first night had a simple, innocent explanation. What remains unclear: the complete sequence of Nolan's movements after the boat separated that afternoon. What the disputed background audio on the distress call actually captured. What the sealed autopsy and the unreleased toxicology results will eventually say once they become public. No charges have been filed. No investigative agency has publicly stated that a crime occurred. That's the entire shape of the case, as it currently stands. Smaller than a lot of the online speculation would suggest, and considerably heavier than a simple, tidy accident would be. It's worth pausing here on the institutional side of this case, separate from the family, separate from the friends, separate from the online noise. State investigators took custody of the physical evidence early on, which is standard procedure in a case involving an unexplained death. That custody is also the reason the family's independent medical examiner didn't have full access to everything when conducting their own review, a limitation Nancy Grace specifically flagged as one of her open questions. Investigators agreed to a joint forensic examination of Nolan's phone, a process that typically takes weeks, sometimes longer, depending on the condition of the device and what data needs to be recovered from it. They've continued to request original, unedited media from people who were on Horn Island that day, a request that suggests the existing footage circulating publicly, including the disputed clip Javon addressed, hasn't been enough to establish a clear picture on its own. And the state autopsy, despite being completed, is being held until it can be presented to a grand jury, a step that indicates prosecutors, at minimum, want the option of pursuing charges on the table, even if no charges have been filed yet and no public statement has named a suspect or a cause. None of that confirms wrongdoing, but it does show an investigation that hasn't been closed out as a routine accidental death. Not yet. Not while evidence remains under seal and a grand jury presentation is still pending. That institutional caution is its own kind of signal, even without a headline attached to it. Whatever the eventual answer turns out to be, there's a family that's been living inside these open questions for weeks now, with no resolution in sight. Elmore Wanley has to sit with the fact that his son's final hours have become a public argument between two competing accounts, neither of which he was there in person to confirm for himself. Javon Williams has to sit with the fact that the version of his best friend that most of the public accepted first, the one who quietly chose to stay behind, never matched the person he actually spent years alongside. And Toshi Mahans has to sit with the specific memory of standing outside a dark house for 15 minutes, waiting on an explanation that kept changing every few minutes. None of that resolves the case on its own, but it's worth remembering. Underneath every unanswered question discussed here, there are people who aren't debating an abstract theory for entertainment. They're describing someone they lost and trying to make sense of a story that, to them, doesn't add up. For a family in that position, every new interview, every new theory posted online, every new commentator weighing in, adds another layer to a grief that hasn't even had the chance to settle yet. There's no version of this case, however it eventually resolves, that gives Nolan's family back the version of events they'd actually want, the one where he comes home. The next real movement in this case isn't going to come from another television interview. It's going to come from documents, grand jury proceedings, forensic results from Nolan's phone, toxicology findings, once they're finally released. Whatever's actually contained in that disputed background audio. Until those materials become public, everything else discussed in this video, the friend's account, Javon's account, Elmore's account, Toshima Hansa's account, sits in the same category. Testimony, not proof. Pieces of a timeline that still has real gaps in it. That's not a failure of the investigation, and it's not evidence of a cover-up either. That's simply where this case currently stands, based on everything that's been made public so far. Here's what's true, and will remain true, no matter which version eventually turns out to be accurate. Nolan Wells left for Horn Island with a group of friends on July 4, 2026, and he never came back with them. The people who were physically there say he made that choice himself, freely, and planned to return later on his own. The people who knew him the longest, his best friend, his father, say that choice doesn't sound like something he'd ever actually do, based on everything they know about him. Both of those things have now been said publicly, under scrutiny, by name, on the record, and to this day, no one, not investigators, not the family, not the friends who were on that island, has been able to fully explain the 15 minutes it took to produce Nolan's phone on the first night he was reported missing. That's where this case still stands. Not resolved, not closed, just waiting on the parts of the story that haven't been made public yet. If you've followed this case from the beginning, you already know how quickly a story like this can calcify online. A first version gets repeated enough times that it starts to feel settled, even when it isn't. What this video has tried to do is slow that process down, not to argue for one version over the other, not to accuse anyone of anything they haven't been formally accused of, just to lay both accounts next to each other, honestly, and let the gaps between them stay visible instead of getting smoothed over. Because that's ultimately what separates a responsible account of a case like this from the version that just spreads the fastest. The friends who were there have told their story, consistently, for weeks. Javon Williams and Elmore Wanley have told a different one, also consistently, also for weeks. Toshima Hans has added a detail neither side has been able to fully explain. And a state autopsy, a toxicology report, and a phone's forensic data are all still sitting behind a wall of process. Sealed, pending, unreleased, waiting for a grand jury, a lab, or an investigator to finally open them up to the public. When they do, some of what's been said in this video may hold up exactly as described. Some of it may not. That's the nature of an ongoing investigation. It doesn't move at the speed of public interest. It moves at the speed of evidence. Until it catches up, the most honest thing that can be said about Nolan Wells' final hours on Horn Island is also the simplest. He left with a group of friends. He didn't come back with them, and more than a month later, no one, not the people who loved him, not the people investigating his death, can yet say with certainty exactly why. The 15 minutes you heard about at the start of this video are still unexplained, and until someone explains them, this case doesn't get to close.